Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started. So, welcome to the first event in the IRCPL IAS SAI project, Rethinking Public Religion in Africa and South Asia, which is being funded by the Luce, as well as some IRCPL monies and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. It's a pleasure to have you here. This is our first event in a 3-year project, so I'm very glad to be able to introduce our speaker today. Many of you might have no idea who I am because I'm brand new to Columbia. My name is Matthew Engelke. I've just arrived this summer, and I'm the director of IRCPL. And it's a pleasure to see so many people here, and I'm looking forward to the discussions this afternoon. So we will hear Dr. Jain speak for about an hour, and then move on to, she and I will then have a brief chat, and then we'll open it up to discussions. I might just ask a question or two. But before I turn it over to her, let me just tell you a bit about Dr. Jain. She is an associate professor of Indian visual culture and contemporary art at the University of Toronto. She trained in art history and theory at the University of Sydney, and her work is very much about art, but in fact it crosses several disciplinary boundaries. And this is evident, for instance, in her wonderful book, Gods in the Bazaar, The Economies of Indian Calendar Art, which was published by Duke University Press in 2007. And Gods in the Bazaar takes us on a journey through a number of terrains, both literal and figurative. These include the town of Sivaksi, home to much of the printing industry that serves as the ground of her research, but also into the details, both blurry and defined, of India's public spheres and zones of exchange, secular and sacred. Dr. Jain moves gracefully in the book from the registers of ethnography, giving us sensitive portraits of the individuals with whom she worked, to those of the technician and aesthete, as in her compelling analysis of how the processes of deep and vivid color saturation in the calendar art index both pious commitments to darshan and commercial agendas. Dr. Jain's current work, about which we will hear this afternoon, is an important extension of her long-standing commitments to exploring the modes and moods of publicity, as well as challenging the divides between such concepts as religion, the economy, and politics. It is once again a pleasure to have her here as part of the Luce project on rethinking public religion. And let me turn over to Dr. Jain now, who will speak on when the gods emerge from the temples. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that really thoughtful introduction. I'm sorry, I'm just going to put this somewhere else. And thank you for this lovely invitation to you and Walid Hammam at the Institute for Religion, Culture and Public Life, also to Tracine Nichols, wherever she is, for handling all the organizing, and of course to all of you for coming out. This is I'm very touched that there are so many of you here, and a little daunted by who's in the room. So my talk today does draw on some of the new work, but it also builds on the earlier work, as those of you who know it will see. I think I'm just going to launch pretty much straight in because I'm worried it might end up getting a little long. So As some of you may know, India is imminently poised to break the record for the world's tallest statue with the 597-foot tall Statue of Unity, twice the size, twice the height of the Statue of Liberty. Narendra Modi initiated the project in 2010 when he was still Chief Minister of Gujarat. So it's a figure of Sardar Patel, India's first Deputy Prime Minister, overlooking a controversial megadam in Gujarat named after him. The inauguration is actually slated for October the 31st, in a couple of weeks, although construction at the site isn't quite finished. But what some of you may not know is that this is just the latest, grandest statue in a genre that emerged with primarily religious statues in the late 1980s and early 1990s, right in tandem with the economic reforms that brought India into the global economy after decades of socialist-style protectionism. And this form soon became a prominent feature of India's religious and then political landscape. So much so that in the run-up to the 2014 elections, most prominent politicians were participating in what have come to be called statue wars, vying for taller and taller statues catering to their constituencies, or vote banks as they're called. Now, the emergence of the big statue genre has followed the pattern of nearly every new image technology in India from the late colonial period onwards. In that, their most immediate popular uptake has been for representing religious or mythic themes, or actually as icons that are incorporated into devotional practices, new and old. And this spans from the 19th century adoption of naturalist painting techniques, printing, the proscenium stage, photography and cinema, to TV, audio cassettes and CDs, video, animation, and now animatronic displays, IMAX, vinyl billboards, and of course digital media, including cell phones with their WhatsApp and Facebook icons and mantras. Anyone who's on a WhatsApp group knows what I'm talking about. So all of these new materializations of religion emerge into a vernacular arena that addresses a particular kind of public, imagined in quite specific ways as both religious and democratic. So how might such images from modern India help us in rethinking public religion? I want to address this in three parts, ultimately arguing that these images point to certain problematic habits of methodological essentialism when it comes to religion, particularly religious images. So in the first part, I focus on ideas of the public, describing a vernacular conception of a religious public, and in the second, on ideas of religion. In each, emergent forms of iconopraxis in India demonstrate why ideas of the public and of religion, forged in Europe but via Europe's encounters with its others, are most fruitfully thought of precisely as sites of encounter or assemblage. That is, the forms and formulations of religio-political publicness are emergent, always in process, as is the boundary work between religious and secular that both maintains this distinction and conjoins the material forms and practices associated with these domains. So in the third part, I use my Indian examples to revisit Walter Benjamin's distinction between two modes of artistic reception, cult value and exhibition value, in his legendary essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Here, you'll recall Cult value inheres in sacred images, hidden from view, with access controlled by priests, while exhibition value is instituted by the public viewing of images within the secular frame of the bourgeois artwork. At the heart of both forms of value is the aura of the authentic image. The cultic aura derives from sequestration and invisibility, while the artworks is shored up by visibility and the public affirmation of genius. But what happens to public, visible, religious images in this schema, that is, to public religion? At stake in this question are the time, place, and nature of publicness, of religion, and of images. So let's start then with publics. The historical scholarship on South Asia has very productively illuminated the public side of public religion as part of the flurry of interrogations of Habermas's normative model of the bourgeois public sphere, following the English translation of the structural transformation of the public sphere. Looking, for instance, at festivals, processions, and the so-called riots that often accompanied them, it showed how South Asian publics have often been predicated on collective affect, often devotional affect, and communal belonging, rather than a liberal secular notion of individual subjecthood. And these publics have been enacted through embodied, spatialized spectacles of self-presencing, often organized around charismatic leaders rather than reasoned debate. While there's been a tendency in this work to posit a binary opposition between these modalities of publicness, I want to emphasize the coexistence of these modalities and the circuits or continuums between them. And I'd suggest that this is a more useful and accurate way to describe the situation of structural unevenness that colonial sites illuminate particularly clearly, but isn't limited to the ex-colonies. Take, for example, the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, a political association established in 1870 to seek equal political and social status for Indian and British subjects in colonial India. Sabha in Hindi and Marathi means assembly. Sarvajanik is a compound of sarva, meaning all, and jan, meaning people. So all the people, or we might say the public. So sarvajanik is the adjectival form, right? In English, public is both adjective and noun, people and space, right? So the Sabha was dominated by upwardly mobile Chitpavan Brahmins who had used the English language to gain positions in government and education. And its proceedings were published in a quarterly English language journal. It was therefore accused of representing Brahmin interests and not being truly Sarvajanik, particularly by the anti-caste activist Jyotirao Phule, who started his own explicitly religious Sarvajanik Satya Dharma. So literally a true religion for all people. So you can see how the Sabha, with its literate, anglophone, upper caste, putatively secular male membership, followed the model of a bourgeois public sphere, public with its many layers of masked exclusion. But while it was initially led by moderates, in 1895 the Sabha was taken over by the Hindu nationalist hardliner Tilak, soon after he initiated the immensely popular Ganapati Utsav festival, where temporary idols of Ganesh are worshipped in neighbourhood shrines over several days and then taken out in these spectacular processions for ritual immersion. Neighbourhood festival organizations adopted the term Sarvajanik, this time to signify the festival's participatory, inclusive nature. And in Bengal, the cognate term Sarvajanin was used for the public Durga Puja emerging a little later. Now, what made these festivals sarvajanik was the participation of people other than elite landowners, princes, and wealthy merchants in creating, installing, and worshipping idols in publicly accessible spaces. So that this meant that they quickly became sites for local functionaries to consolidate power and patronage networks within a logic of proto-electoral populist representation mediated by untraditional, non-hereditary leaders. And the publicness of these idols is also significant in relation to the sensory regime of caste, where hierarchy and status are pegged to spatial and visual access to the divine in the form of icons in temples, such that so-called untouchables, now self-identifying as Dalits, the oppressed, had been barred from entering temples and often even the streets around them for fear of ritual pollution. So this emergence of the gods from temples indexes a significant symbolic upheaval in the caste sensorium and the power of cult value, even if in practice the public shrines of Ganapati Utsav and Durga Puja actually addressed neighborhoods that were already spatially demarcated by caste. This, I think, is what is at stake in the publicness of the gods, in the very literal emergence of this new form of iconopraxis. However, this new inclusivity, like that of the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha and like that of the Hindu nation envisaged by Tilak and his ilk, was still predicated on exclusions. The publicness of the Ganapati Utsav, with noisy processions, as is still the case, passing through non-Hindu localities, was orchestrated primarily as a provocation to Muslims against the colonial state's attempts to maintain public order. So Tilak demanded the right to play music in front of mosques, which had been banned actually by the 1890 District Police Act. Apart from its provocative intent, this also meant that Muslim musicians playing in Hindu processions could no longer maintain a respectful silence when passing mosques. So this strategy also re-signified Hindu and Muslim festivals as mutually exclusive. For what these public festivals represented was an exclusive yet expansive formulation of Hinduness, in keeping with the project of Hindu unification or Sangathan, geared towards electoral representation and the fear of minoritization. Because remember, this is sort of in the lead up to independence, right? But the Sabha begins with wanting electoral representation. This consolidation of numbers echoed earlier Hindu reform movements' mimetic responses to Christian missionary proselytization, such as the Arya Samaj's program from the 1850s of Shuddhi, or purification of Dalits, Muslims, and Christians to bring them back into the Hindu fold. And we're seeing a kind of revival of that under the name of Ghar Wapsi, or return home. So this was a mimicry of Christian missionary activity. Such trans-religious mimicry also characterized the Ganapati Utsav, which was modeled on Muslim Muharram processions, and continued as Dalits took up the form for Ravidas and Ambedkar processions. This mimeticism was enabled by the colonial state's biopolitical use of the category of religion as an overarching term of comparison and distinction between commensurable communities, made efficacious by the law, taxonomic operations like the census, and indeed the very organization of time in the almanac. And in this Cones and Company's almanac, you can see they've divided, I mean, it tells you the Christian calendar, Jewish, Parsi, Muslim, Hindu, etc. But it also has these translations of days of the week and months of the year into English, Hindu, and Mohammedan, right? Which, and often the Hindu and Mohammedan are the same, but it's, you know, you can see this kind of exclusivist taxonomic operation in progress here. So this religio-political partage was materialized in new visual forms that both represented and were addressed to a public envisioned as plural from the get-go. So here, heterogeneous religious and other practices came to be organized within the same spatial, temporal, and formal infrastructures. We see a similar commensuration in most new media during this period and beyond. If festivals made Hindu iconopraxis commensurable and competitive with Muslim public processions, oil painting and proscenium theatre as novel means of figuring mythic and religious themes meant the translation of diverse types of iconopraxis into a homogeneous visual form, with photographic and then chromolithographic reproduction, further standardizing images at the level of infrastructure, not so much the kind of visual elements, but the very substrate, formats, colors, sizes, surfaces, textures, right? So here the emergent force of novelty, of mass reproduction, and the publicness, mobility, and exteriority of images has, I think, more to do with these processes of mimesis, commensuration, and redistribution at a formal level than with the destruction of cult or aura. In this light, then, the sarvajanik emerges as a vernacular modality of publicness that folds religion in with democracy, strategically both invoking the normative ideals of the bourgeois public sphere and departing from them, slipping between reasoned debate and devotional affect, English and the vernaculars, and the features of publics and counterpublics. The public sphere has been theorized as a domain distinct from the state, but as a formation of the colonized in a situation of structural inequality, the sarvajanik's raison d'etre was not primarily to exert pressure on the state from a socially authorized, property-owning, but otherwise unmarked outside. It was more to enact the visibility, recognition, and inclusion that provide access to resources and power, not just state, but also social, economic, and divine, for communities marked as distinct in an explicitly plural polity. So the salient distinctions for the sarvajanik public are not so much between state versus non-state forces, or between private as domestic versus public as stranger sociable, but between community-based inclusion versus exclusion from both state and non-state networks of power and resources, and between spatial or territorial inclusions versus exclusions. Note that the central importance of access to space remains intact here, and with it the sensible basis of caste distinction. As a counterpublic, the sarvajanik is a space of what Michael Warner calls poetic world-making. That is, it imagines and attempts to realize a world, which is why and how it mobilizes new aesthetic forms, but it ultimately also seeks a more capacious consensus within the hegemonic sensory regime of caste Hinduism. And this program continues in the emergence of other new forms of public religion. The sarvajanik public as a vehicle for the Hindu nationalist retooling of caste in relation to electoral representation also appears in the innovative temple form of the Birla Mandir in New Delhi. This self-proclaimed Sarvajanik Mandir, or temple, was inaugurated by Gandhi in 1939 on condition that it admit all castes. Can you see on there? It says public worship, and in Hindi it says it's a Sarvajanik Mandir. Right? So it was inaugurated by Gandhi. Gandhi said, "I'll only do this if you allow all castes." 1939 was also the year of the path-breaking Madras Temple Entry Ordinance that authorized temple access for all classes of Hindus. That ordinance was challenged by powerful heads of matts, or monastic orders, who in the course of the legal battles introduced a distinction between matts and what they called public temples. So we're seeing a two-way process here. As the gods emerged from the temples, temples themselves were designated as public spaces to safeguard the authority of the matts, that is, to shore up the cult value of the matts in the face of the temple's exhibition value. Now, if that was the response of cultic Brahmanism, Gandhi's embrace of the Harijans, or children of God, as he called Dalits, has to be situated within the heated negotiations over electoral reservations for minorities that were catalyzed by the 1928 boycott of the all-white Simon Commission on Constitutional Reforms. Particularly significant here is the Pune Pact, signed in 1933, in which Gandhi and the Hindu nationalist leader Madan Mohan Malviya overruled B.R. Ambedkar's plea for separate electorates for so-called untouchables. For Gandhi, it was unthinkable that Harijans should be classified as external to the Hindu fold. To do so would be to destroy the very fabric of Hindu society. He, as was Gandhi's wont, went on a hunger fast and got his way. A year later, Malviya laid the foundation stone of the Birla Mandir. In the built form of the Birla Mandir, as with the Pune Pact, we see a dovetailing, albeit an uneasy one, of Malviya's Hindu orthodox and Gandhi's reformist approaches to forging an expanded, inclusive Hindu polity. Its extensive exhibitionary program of murals and inscriptions mounts a pedagogical campaign for those unaccustomed to textual knowledge, while also reinscribing the authority of the text, so central to Brahminical power. While its landscaped grounds also explicitly reiterate its public nature, the excessive signage peppering these public spaces — you can't go up two steps without running into a sign — peppers these public spaces with order words at every step, which also betray an anxiety about hygiene and civilized behavior that maps the idioms of caste purity onto colonial biopolitics. Also note the expansive definition of Hindus here. So it says all Hindus, i.e. all branches of Sri Sanatan Dharma, which is like the non-reformist variety of Hinduism, but then they say including Arya, reformist, Buddhist, Jain, Sikh. So suddenly Hindus are all these people, right? So vis-a-vis Muslim and Christian minorities. And of course they're saying, you know, this temple is open to all Hindus, including Harijans, it's explicitly stated, subject to, immediately, the prescribed conditions of cleanliness. Cleanliness is the first thing. Full faith and sincere devotion. And then you can't have infectious diseases, and you can't be a beggar, okay? So there's a lot going on in that one sign, and there are many. So again, a new aesthetic form indexes and participates in the contested terrain on which religion and politics come to inhabit shared idioms. The other thing that we see as electoral representation is put on the table is that the discourse and value of quantification, foregrounded by electoral politics, is taken up by religion, and in particular by neo-spiritual movements that can't resort to the ancient kind of auratic sources of legitimacy and authority, so they work with the aura of numbers, characterizing both governmentality and statistics, as well as canonical traditions. So there's no time to go into all of that here, but here's an example for you. A leader of one of the neo-spiritual cults in Mysore, who is in the Guinness Book of Records twice for his aviary and for his bonsai collection. And there are others, you know, the Art of Living, I think holds the Guinness record for the number of Guinness records. They have, like, you know, the world's largest vegetarian buffet, largest number of, you know, kuchipudi dancers on stage, you know, that kind of thing. So there's a thing. Okay, so let's turn now to the approach to religion in the scholarship on South Asian public imagery in another genre emerging in the colonial period, late colonial period, bazaar prints. So here, the very useful work of Chris Pinney and Sumiti Ramaswamy has demonstrated how the nationalism that popular prints index and produce is shot through with religiosity. Both use these prints as an image-based refutation of Benedict Anderson's much critiqued account of secular nationalism, stressing the mythic, if not deified, nature of the nation space and themes of sacrifice and martyrdom in nationalist affect. So far, so good. But there's an issue with the way that this unfolds. Pinney, for instance, runs with the opposition that Anderson posits between Benjamin's idea of homogeneous empty time as the modern nation's putatively secular temporality, and a messianic time that monolithically starts to stand in for all varieties of religious time. Indian bazaar prints thus partake of messianic temporality. Now, there may well be a case to be made for this, given, say, Sami Khatib's argument that Benjamin deploys his dialectical notion of the messianic within, but in excess of, a secular horizon. But this isn't the move being made here. Pinney's messianic time, like Anderson's, is indeed just a catch-all religious category that does not speak to Benjamin's singular retake on a specifically Judaic formulation. My point here is not so much to plead for justice for Benjamin, though that would be nice too. It's more about how our clunky notion of religion lends itself to such moves. In Anderson's binary schema, religion and secularism are mutually exclusive. Further, they're ranged in linear succession. Pinney and Ramaswamy demonstrate that religion never went away, but they don't ask whether what apparently persists is the same as what existed before. So religion becomes ahistorical. Thus, for instance, Pinney's emphasis on the corpothetic or embodied relationship of devotional engagement implies a continuity between temple icons and those in domestic or public settings. And again, while this may be valid in one way, it forecloses an examination of what is new or otherwise here, of what kinds of other things religion turns into in its publicness or its articulation with nationalism through the new genre of prints. So religion figures here as some kind of pre-modern leftover rather than taking on its own modalities of modernity. Now, the trouble here is that while ideas of modernity as necessarily secular or of religion as a thing of the past have been soundly critiqued and are disproved every day on the news, the conceptual habits of this polarized and temporally linear schema thoroughly pervade our everyday understandings of religiosity, and thence the undeniable force of these understandings in the world. I mean, just take, for instance, the routine dismissals of Hindutva or of Orthodox Islam or Judaism as regressive, where this temporal backwardness is also implicitly mapped onto spatial and cultural otherness. I'd suggest that one reason for the stickiness of these habits is that there is indeed a distinction to be made between those forms of religiosity that were not shaped in relation to a secular horizon, or what Charles Taylor has called the immanent frame, and those that are, between pre- and post-secular forms, if you will, if you want to use those temporalizing terms. Now, the confusion arises when these forms are lumped together under the singular rubric of religion, and is further compounded by the fact that while we may no longer inhabit a pre-secular horizon, those material forms and modalities of value and authority are still knocking about in various ways, both in conjunction with and distinct from post-secular ones. So, for instance, modern revivalist movements make primordialist claims for a putatively religiously authorized idea or practice, creationism, caste, taboos on homosexuality, control of women's bodies, whatever. Museums in India enjoin visitors not to pray to the icons on display. So, religion or the sacred is neither simply that which is rendered obsolete, nor is it simply that which persists in some kind of authentic, essential, or singular form, but in practice it ends up being treated as both, even as religion is constantly being remade to become a prolific site of emergence. It's a bit complicated. So, but again, I think public iconopraxis and the discourses around it provide a good site to get at these kinds of complexities. Ongoing temple renovation and construction, bazaar prints, and the recent monumental icons demonstrate, for instance, I mean, speaking of forms of value and authority that are still knocking about, they demonstrate that in India, religious patronage remains one of the most powerful ways of maintaining or achieving status and gaining social mobility. Far more so, of course, than fine art as a modality of bourgeois distinction in the manner that Bourdieu described for 1970s France. Temple construction never went out of style. It's the first thing that many Hindus and Jains do when they achieve economic success. So, for instance, Delhi's Birla Mandir that I just spoke about was just the first in the extensive, innovative temple building program of the major industrialists, the Birlas, who I think are now on their 16th or 17th temple. And they also created religious theme parks in the late 1980s. This is a Ramayan theme park, concrete dioramas, and the early 90s. This is a garden across from Delhi's international airport. So in the pre-liberalization economy, bazaar prints in the form of calendars gifted to customers and business associates were a common means of annually renewing commercial cum social networks that shored up the moral standing of the donor. Now, monumental icons are also used to consolidate the status and technological or infrastructural prowess of post-liberalization players, old and new. So if the Birlas are an example of the old, A controversial new player was the audio baron Gulshan Kumar, who famously started out as a roadside fruit juice vendor and then consolidated an audio cassette, CD, video, and now film production empire, only to be assassinated while exiting a temple, likely by the Bombay underworld. And the jury is still out on that. The case is not closed. So media scholars Ravi Sundaram and Lawrence Liang have focused on Gulshan Kumar's use of piracy to gain social mobility. But in keeping with a kind of habitual assumption that religion belongs to the past and media to the present, totally ignore the key role of public religion in this mobility. The CDs and videos of devotional bhajans and pilgrimage, where Kumar's image features prominently, the giant Shiva statue at his studio in Noida, characteristically pirated from the Birlas, and his patronage of a temple and a big Shiva statue near Dwarka, one of the Char Dham, which are 4 important Hindu pilgrimage centers centered on powerful ancient mutts or monasteries. So note the circuitry here between cultic authority and new exhibitionary forms. Right? I said earlier, the mutts had objected to the publicness of the temple. Now there's a kind of détente between them. So it's hardly surprising that Kumar sought an association with the cultic aura of Dwarka Dham. But I call this a circuit because it works both ways. The auratic authority of powerful ancient temples is reinforced, not diminished, by featuring in devotional pilgrimage CDs or pilgrimage videos. We see a similar circuit at work in the political adoption of the monumental statue form in the attempt to garner favor with local vote banks. So, politicians are using the same vocabulary of mobility and status. Here, however, politicians tend to maintain an arm's length from religion per se, so these projects usually unfold under the secular rubrics of tourism development, cultural heritage, philanthropy, even environmentalism. In the case of monumental statue impresario Pavan Chamling, chief minister for about 2 decades of the Himalayan state of Sikkim since 1994, this boundary work enables him to cater to 2 major religious blocs, Hindus and Buddhists, via 2 colossal statues flanking his constituency, Namchi, even as he himself belongs to the indigenous Kirant community. These gestures of recognition do double duty in shoring up his political standing through this economic initiative to develop tourism in the South Sikkim area, which is drier and less naturally attractive than other parts of the state. So these statues are a 135 Guru Rinpoche or Padmasambhava, completed in 2004, with a garden inaugurated on World Environment Day, and a 108-foot Shiva. Notice the numbers again, 108, 111, auspicious numbers, at the 2011 Char Dham Pilgrimage cum Cultural Center. Note this formulation that conjoins pilgrimage to culture while also maintaining them as distinct. This complex also features scaled down replicas of the temples at the 4 Char Dham pilgrimage centers, each manned by priests and large enough to enter and worship in. Here, photography inside the temple is a punishable offense. So even as these are replicas, the replication of their sancta sanctorum is prohibited. Replication and aura coexist in the same object. Indeed, aura itself is replicated. Now, the ritual authenticity of these replicated temples was established via the site's inauguration by Swarupanand Saraswati, the Shankaracharya, or head guru of the Dwarka Mutt, one of the Char Dham. Similarly, the Dalai Lama laid the Guru Rinpoche's foundation stone, as well as inaugurating a 95-foot seated Sakyamuni at Ravangla, also in South Sikkim, in 2013. And there's another story there about a local big man, Didi Bhutia, who becomes actually the Minister for Power in Chamling's cabinet. Now, the sights of the Sakyamuni project team were set not so much on domestic tourist pilgrims as on the international Buddhist circuit, and on what they described as both the pilgrim and the aesthete. So another both and formulation that nonetheless maintains a boundary between religious and secular, religion and art, all projected onto the same object or image. So now, to conclude, what do these complex conjunctures of religion and publicness, where both and coexists with either or, do to Benjamin's distinction between cult value and exhibition value? It must be obvious by now that my concern, like Benjamin's in the artwork essay, is to think about the politics of new image technologies and public visibility at a moment when intensified capitalist development unfolds under an authoritarian political regime with a populist ideology of ultranationalism that is both palingenetic and futurist. But of course, there's a crucial difference. For the public exhibitionary address of the forms I've described is not that of the bourgeois artwork, but of explicitly religious images subject to worship. Benjamin's text seems to suggest that exhibition value only appears with the public showing an appreciation of artworks, and therefore implicitly only applies to them. In his urgent need to respond to the deeply alienated aesthetics of futurism and his understandable desire for what he calls a tremendous shattering of the auratic basis of tradition inherent in cult, which persists in the bourgeois artwork, Benjamin is simply not oriented to the idea that religion too, in Europe as elsewhere, has always had its elements of exhibition value as well as cult value, a visible public side that complements and reinforces the hidden sacred side. So the modern Indian images that I've described are not just instances of post-colonial otherness. They also illuminate how the ideology of modernism disavows non-modern phenomena within the metropole too. For in fact, the artwork never fully supplanted religious images and cult value in Western Europe either. And this is evident in architecture. Think of church spires or the bells that ring out over the most modern of cities, processions, festivals, roadside shrines, monumental or polychrome statues and prints, not to mention films, televangelism, multimedia spectacles, and social media. So, I mean, I don't need to, I'm preaching to the converted here. So, such forms of public religion and iconopraxis and their exhibition value have been hidden in plain sight under a concatenation of modernist formulations. These include modernity's secular self-image that consigns religion to the past, and/or ideas of religion as sacred, that is, set apart or sequestered from everyday life, or spiritual, right, non-material, invisible, following a hegemonic Protestant religiosity with its emphasis on interiority, the word, and personal faith, And here again, I just think referring to all religions as faiths, or even worse, confessional communities, is as peculiar as calling Hindu icons messianic. So I'd like to suggest a supplement to Benjamin's valuable formulations of the aura, cult value, and exhibition value that hopefully does justice to his own complex sense of temporality and of the multiply auratic aspects of the image, as well as to the actual fate of both icons and artworks with the further spread of capitalism and mass culture. I want to think of the visible public face of iconopraxis and of religious images that may or may not also be seen as artworks or as secular in some other way in terms of iconic exhibition value. So this helps us, I think, recognize the dynamic between sequestration and exhibition as a key ingredient of religious authority, instead of just collapsing all religious power and efficacy into the cultic power of sequestration. For, as I've described, the intensification of iconic exhibition value shores up iconic cult value and vice versa, while also expanding the range of forms available for iconopraxis and, in the process, the systems of institutionalized religion in general. Perhaps Benjamin was getting at this dynamic vis-à-vis the artwork in a footnote to the second version of the artwork essay. Here, identifying a tension in Hegelian idealism, he uses Raphael's Sistine Madonna to show how, while, quote, the transition from the first kind of artistic reception, cult value, to the second, exhibition value, characterizes the history of artistic reception in general. Apart from that, a certain oscillation between the two, between these two polar modes of reception can be demonstrated for each work of art, end quote. Benjamin doesn't conceive the newness of the new in terms of linearly substitutive transition or total transformation, but acknowledges the duration and persistence of earlier forms in this oscillation, akin to what I'm calling the circuitry between old and new forms that makes both anew. Thus, as Georges Didi Huberman puts it, quote, the aura and its decline are part of the same system, end quote, where decline is not so much disappearance as declension. Again, Georges Didi Huberman says, inclining, deviating, or inflecting in a new way. Benjamin doesn't think through this transition come oscillation in relation to religion, only to art. This is because, as I suggested, in his milieu, it was art rather than religion, that is, an idea of art explicitly counterposed to an idea of religion, that was seen as a palpable force of social distinction, and hence also key to shattering the bourgeois order. I've shown how the reverse has been the case in India, whose democratic polity was seen as explicitly religiously plural from the start, and religion and caste have been a primary ground for value projects whose social, political, and economic aspects are deeply intermeshed, and in whose sensible infrastructure vision is deeply intermeshed with touch and access to space. So what we see in the newness of the new forms I've described is both the assertion of democratic claims and the protean capacities of religion and caste to re-territorialize these claims, as the ritual forms of religion expand to meld with those of democracy and vice versa. So the least we can do, I think, is respond with suppleness to these layered forms of religiosity and publicness, so as to recognize and call out the other potentials in their emergence. In this case, the deep upheavals in the sensorium of caste, lest they get reinfolded into habit, and lest we become inured to the shock of profane illumination. Thank you. Should I stay? I got
Sure,
yeah.
yeah. So, thank you very much, Kajri. That was incredible, and a wonderful set of images for us to consider alongside your talk and your pushing Benjamin, who seems to have endless mileage.
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciate the way in which you've engaged with the themes and in terms of rethinking public religion, and you've given us a lot to think about. I'm sure many of the people in the room who have much greater knowledge of the particularities of South Asia and India will have a lot of questions, so I won't ask too many questions, but I do want to just begin by asking a few maybe framing questions. I wonder if you can begin, maybe in the most general sense, what I'd like to draw out is a bit more about the genealogy that you're tracing here between the late 19th, early 20th century history, then just before the Second World War, and then just around the period of India's economic liberalization in the early 1990s. In terms of different ideas and conceptions of publicness, I wonder if I can ask you to say a bit more about this latest phase or period of monumental statues. And also how it relates to infrastructure, which you used in your talk as in many different respects. But the respect that I'm interested in is one that we were talking about before the lecture today, which is infrastructure in the most maybe mundane sense of the relationship between these statues and space, particularly as you mentioned to me, many of these are visible or near the sides of roads. So I wonder if you can just say a bit more about the relationship between the infrastructures of the state, that is to say roads, public spaces, city squares, etc., or indeed the positioning on hills in districts in terms of indexing political power or authority, and the specificity of why statues, right? Especially because as someone who's doesn't know this area of the world well, although pushing a bit, it's not exactly the same space, but when one thinks of what's going on in South Asia, at least broadly conceived over the past 20 years, one thinks that this kind of monumental stuff, these aren't new in the sense of the destruction by the Taliban of the bombing on Buddhas, which are those were pretty monumental. So are there kind of links either rhetorically to that longer history, or what is it about bringing the gods out of the temples in this particular way that's tied to the current moment? So yeah, why statues? That would be my first question. And then my second question, and then I'll stop, is asking you to reflect a bit more on how you're using Benjamin. And of course, Chris Pinney has also written a lot about Benjamin and the aura in the context of his work in India. And I guess my question is, to what extent can we treat the aura as a stable concept? I mean, you're destabilizing many of the terms in play here, but I wonder if I could push you to destabilize the notion of aura a bit more, because if it is indeed the case that conceptions of religion, politics, and art are tied to particular socio-historical configurations, couldn't we say the same about aura, right? And it just seems to me that there would be, what is distinctive about the sensory regimes that you are, that form part of the backdrop of your interests? And in particular, when one thinks, again, as an outsider, but my understanding of the senses as someone who works on Christianity in Europe and Africa might be very different from an understanding of the senses in South Asia, particularly as organized around practices of worship or darshan, and this effort by people who write about darshan to break down the distinctions between touch and sight, right? That it's a kind of, that it has these, it's a as Pinney puts it, a visual intermingling, or there's a haptic dimension. And Benjamin is writing about a very particular sensorium as well, or indeed set of sensoriums connected to the European traditions.
Sure.
So why should we treat the concept of aura as this kind of transcultural object or problematic to look at? So those are my two questions.
Great. Okay, I mean, I could just spend the rest of the day answering your questions.
Because I know there will be a lot of other questions. Yeah.
So let me try and do this quickly. Why statues? I think there are very material and contingent. I mean, you asked for a genealogy, and that's the thing about genealogies, is that they are quite contingent. And so I think that's what's happened is, my method has been to work with practitioners. So in this case, I've been working with the sculptors who produce these images, these statues, and trying to figure out, how they came to make a big one. And there are many different answers, so this form actually strangely sort of crops up more or less at the same time in different ways, in different places. But there's a couple of stories here. I mean, one is, for example, the Ganapati Utsav becomes, right, so why statues? There are statues in the temple. They come out of the temple on Ganapati Utsav. Then the same sculptors start to build bigger and bigger ones. And a neo-spiritual movement, in fact the Chinmaya mission in this case, was one of the pioneers of the big statue form. So they got this guy from the south who was a Ganapati statue sculptor who had done a particularly good one to make a big Hanuman, and then a big Ganapati, and then another bigger Ganapati, so that was one story. Another was, I showed you the Panchavati, the Ramayan theme park of the Birlas. So again, they go from a landscaped temple, the Birla Mandir, which I don't know if any of you have been there. It has these concrete bears and sort of animals of various sorts, camels, and in fact there's even a dinosaur now. So it's landscaped with these concrete animals. So there's a kind of diorama theme park aspect to it. Then they do the same thing at Panchavati in Pilani, which is their hometown. So there's a lot of, again, this kind of scalar circuitry between the hometown and the metropolis, the big city, where you're trading on your influence in one place to leverage in another. So there's a sculptor who suddenly, I love this story, I just have to tell you. So there's this episode in the Ramayana when Hanuman has to pick up Ram and Lakshman and put them on his shoulders and carry them to safety. So this sculptor wants to make this diorama. And then he realizes that if he makes Hanuman life-size, Ram and Lakshman to fit on his shoulders will have to be very small. So he decides to upscale Hanuman. And he makes a 12-foot Hanuman. But what's interesting is it's because it's outside, right? It's a theme park. So his scale is dictated by the landscape, right? So it has to be more realistic than if it was inside a temple. So again, it's this kind of, it's a contingent thing that happens, but it's to do with bringing the gods outside, So, there are many different, but also, coming to your aura question, also, or rather, not yet. Let's not mix them. But there is also a kind of Buddhist and Jain lineage of already outdoor statues, which in fact these sculptors do, again, plug into. So the Buddhist statues is one, but also, which is a pretty unbroken, in various parts of the world, there are big Buddhist statues. But again, one of the early statues along a highway, not a highway, but a major artery, the Mehrauli-Gurgaon Road, is a Jain Mahavir at Ahimsa Sthal who's made in granite. And so, but this is a revival of an earlier tradition from Karnataka, and in fact the sculptor was from Karnataka. So what happens is, but it happens in a very peculiarly globalized way because there's a Jain watchmaker in Old Delhi who sends his son to Japan on a technological exchange thing. He goes to a Japanese watch factory, and there he sees the Kamakura Buddha. And then he says, oh, well, we have a tradition, let's do the same thing. So again, there's a sort of very specific story about globalization, but also it takes us right back to these medieval sculptures from Karnataka. So, which is all to say, there's a material story behind this tradition. Aura, I very much appreciate your question because I do think I am using aura really more or less synonymously, I think, with efficacy. And I have to think about that and perhaps problematize why I'm doing that. Because again, you're right, aura is it's a kind of a dematerialized capacity of the image, yeah? And I'm not sure that this is the way it's working here. So that's great. I need to think about it more. But it is I do think that there are historical modes of aura. For instance, I would say that, if there are multiple layers of aura, we could think of celebrity aura as a different modality, that is, in fact, engendered by mass culture, and the kind of meta-popularity, right? The popularity of popularity is celebrity. And so that's sort of historically specific variety of aura that we need to put on the table with all the other sorts. But I very much appreciate your question about the sensorium and the specificity of the sensorium, because that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. And which sort of emerged as I was thinking about this project and as caste kind of inserted itself more and more into the story. Yes, in the scholarship on darshan, there has been this attempt to think vision and touch together. And that's very much part of the tradition. My issue is with the way that that is celebrated as a kind of resistance. And this comes out of, you know, everyone rethinking the hegemony of vision in the West. And, you know, this is coming out of feminism, it's coming out of, you know, the new materialism, etc. So there's a way in which unpacking the hegemony of vision and putting the corporeal or the material on the table is seen as kind of always already resistant. But I don't think that we can do that easily in the South Asian context, because touch and spatiality are so tied in with caste hegemony, right, and its enforcement. So I would say yes, you know, vision and touch are entangled and, you know, completely intermeshed. But we need to rethink the politics of that. You know, there's a way I would almost argue, and I mean, obviously I need to do more work here, but I think there's a way in which touch actually subtends vision. You know, vision is brought back to issues of touch. And that's kind of what the Darshan people have been saying. You know, there's ways in which, you know, vision is seen as a fluid, you know, a kind of substance that courses between deity and devotee and so on. But what does that mean then? It means that access, substance, corporeality, materiality are key to the way the system works. And what is this system? You know, it is a system based on a kind of privileging of touch. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Let me open it up to questions. Yes?
I'll make it short, because never use two words and one will do, and never use one word when none will do. That's why they brought it out of the temple. Touch, aura. You had an illustration up here with a swastika, looking like a swastika. That illustration had to be wrong, correct? Because a swastika is like this, and a swastika is like that, correct?
Well, I mean, I don't know about the difference in pronunciation, but the
swastika, the way they're
the
shaped.
Nazi swastika goes
you had
one
up
way,
there, yes.
and the
wasn't a
Hindu one
swastika.
goes the other way.
The swastika is the other way, correct? And about the Pope, I just did a lecture on this in Indianapolis. Pope Julius II, he's the one who had the Sistine Chapel. He's the one that told, he made him do it, people don't know. He changed the black family and painted them white in the Sistine Chapel. Because I was the president of Holy Name Society, and the Archbishop told me, you go up there with a razor blade and scrape it, you'll see the black family, but you go into jail. And I was told that 25 years ago. So the art has been changed. And there's a word that you'll have in Sanskrit, advaita. Ego has a lot to do with what you're talking about. Advaita. That's the ego, correct? That's why a lot of things are being done out of ego. Made me think.
I will have to think about that.
We can talk later.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's some food for thought.
Yeah.
But Sandra, did you have a question?
No.
No, you didn't. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
I didn't want to
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for a very thoughtful and intellectually invigorating talk. I wanted to follow up on where you started, and which is to say that to some extent, both the idea of processions and the idea of massive, iconic sculptures have been part of the Indic tradition for a long time. And the question I would have is the distinction between the earlier tradition, whether it's Shravan Beogoda or Bamyan, or the processions in Puri or in South India, versus what happens in the 19th century. And how we make that distinction in terms of both practice and intent. So that's kind of one part of the question. And the other question vis-a-vis the practice in the vision and touch discussion that you just had is that how are these being used compared to the earlier times, especially the medieval period? And whether there's a complete break in the way it's being used, or if there's a complete break in the way they're intended to be used.
Wait, sorry, between
They're
what's being
intended to
used?
use.
They mean
The current large iconic sculptures
Mhm,
or even the
mhm.
procession,
Mhm.
so that we make that clearer distinction between the 19th and into even between the late 19th century and where we are today. Because it seems to me that there is some questions around patronage that needs to be interrogated further, and the questions around usage that needs to be interrogated further.
Mhm.
The last thing I would say is that I think it's interesting that you didn't think of use myopathy at all, and where that fits in vis-a-vis this conventions of sculptures. So in a way, I also think that there's something different going on between procession versus iconic, large size, larger than life sculptures, both in usage and in practice. So there's a lot that I'd love to kind of sort of unpack further, but most importantly, the distinction between the historical traditions, which are also very public. And it seems to me the problem is that often we've discussed in terms of the practice, often in the private sphere, but not enough in this very public sphere that were part and parcel of the practice.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's great, because I mean, I had to be selective in what I presented today, but I mean, these are all very valid questions, and exactly, I mean, part of what I'm trying to do is precisely point to the specificity of what happens at this moment. Because in a way, you know, the minute you see something large, it's so easy, there's this pat response that it's kind of dominant and hegemonic, you know, powerful and phallic, and the end. You know, that's the analysis. But so the question becomes, you know, why after the medieval Jain kinds of statues, Shravan Belagola and so on, why after so many centuries does this form re-emerge? And that's where I feel like it has something to do with these neighborhood festivals, which are different from the temple engineered outings of the deities, right? Which are pretty much orchestrated by priests. I mean, popular festivals, village festivals are different, but this is, you know, this is urban neighborhood festivals, which are sort of grassroots organized, precisely sarvajanik, right? The sarvajanik mandal organizes them. So there is a shift in patronage, is what I'm trying to say, you know, and therefore it can go viral, you know, it can become this mimetic form which various communities take on in different ways. And it becomes, you know, there's a politics at the back end, as it were, in this organization. I mean, it's a lot like what people have argued about fan clubs in the South more recently. You know, you have this kind of grassroots organization where charismatic leaders may emerge. And, you know, so it's a different avenue of mobility. So that's the distinction that I'm trying to make. And that's why I feel like there's more of a connection there between the utsav kind of murtis and the big statues, because it's a similar kind of means of asserting mobility. You know, and again, temples are a bit dicey because maybe if you're not of a particular community, you can't really necessarily patronize the temple in quite the same way. And this is a sort of, it's very good bang for buck, as it were. You know, I mean, you get it's not that expensive to make a huge statue, but it's working in that same idiom of religious patronage, but without some of the strings that are attached. So, I mean, that's why, again, I feel like it's an expansion of the vocabulary, but it's more inclusive. It's the same vocabulary, but it's more inclusive. Is that convincing? Oh, and Mayavati, I mean, there's a lot to say about Mayavati, but...
Maybe I should say. I'm a political scientist, and I'm thinking cynically.
Mm-hmm.
And the ahimsa style I think of as the effort of a particular group of Jains to encroach on a public space and put up a statue which would draw pilgrims, which in turn also, and I think that's very, I mean, right next to our house in Gurgaon, there are people putting up a growing little temple thing in order to establish hold on property. So I'm very cynical about that, and I think it's probably fairly widespread. But that leads me to the larger question of adding into this, that these are entrepreneurial statues in that. There's a lot of people that they generate not just, I mean, pilgrimage generates money, which generates all sorts of things, and I don't know whether anyone has followed the money of that, which leads you then on to the political benefits of this. And then isn't, with that sort of thing, a natural, quote unquote, natural competitive competition for, as Philip and Roy petted, you know, my Hanuman is bigger than your Hanuman, with all of the erotic parts of that there. But it's clearly something that seems to, at least that I've seen in and around Delhi, one big statue begets another big statue, but it's for entrepreneurial, sometimes political, sometimes this, and that's. I mean, it's not necessarily antagonistic to truly religious feeling, and clearly there are things that, but there is that strong, seems to me, strand of entrepreneurial, political, and very private regarded motivations for building these statues.
So my whole thrust here has been to say there is no purely religious which is separate or separable from the commercial or the political, right? I mean, that was the kind of burden of my first book, Gods in the Bazaar, and will be part of the burden of this one, Gods in the Time of Democracy. I mean, absolutely. People have called many of these big statues land grabs, right? But what is a land grab? I mean, what for? Once you put a big statue on some land, you can't do anything else with it, right? So clearly it is a good in and of itself. Having land, performing religious patronage, right? Having a certain kind of visibility, which is political. So, I mean, that's my point, is all of these things are mushed in together. And the fact that, you know, what I want to do is to take people's religiosity seriously. You know, you can't, I feel you can't just dismiss it and say, oh, this is not religious because it's commercial or political, right? I mean, and that idea of pure religiosity, which I think is quite a Protestant idea, you know, a sort of like material versus spiritual frame is at work there. Whereas I think that this is a frame where we have to think them together. And that's why, you know, religious patronage, I don't look at it cynically. I mean, people are performing religiosity in good faith, as it were, you know. But that doesn't preclude the fact that they will get something out of it. Is that?
Oh, I think Jack had a question for us.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Devesh, you go first and then I'll take Jack.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for your talk. I actually just want to ask a quick question about what I felt was like the methodological kind of linchpin for this talk, which was your emphasis on the idea of the circuit. You begin with the circuit as this conceptual way to think outside of binary oppositions. You take us to various kinds of binarisms that may no longer be productive to us today. And I was really taken by your discussion with Matthew about the politics of embodiment that is just assumed to have a resistive kind of a power. So just to think about the circuit a little bit more, in terms of the aura, and you talked about the auratic circuit. When we think circuits in other fields, media, technology studies, and so on, there's always a corollary about the breakdown of the circuit. It would be interesting. We might not need to always think of circuit and breakdown, right? That might also become an unproductive thing. But if we were to think in terms of the waxing and waning of the aura, the phasing and dephasing of an auratic power, then what would be those moments? Those would be very interesting. From misrecognition to indifference to another kind of remixed use value. It would just be interesting for me to think a little bit about that.
No, that's great. That's a lovely way to frame it, I think. I mean, so in the book I have a chapter where I'm looking in detail at iconopraxis at 3 different sites. And you know, there are various modalities of religiosity at work in to different degrees in all of them, all of these sites. One which is kind of pretty cultic, if you like, a sort of temple type religiosity. Then there's a more exhibitionary version, a very sort of entertainment oriented version. And then there's a kind of neo-spiritual version, which is all about meditative spaces and quiet. And, I mean, so there's a kind of typology at work there. And I think that the breakdown of the circuit happens at times when one of these modalities predominates over the other. You know, so there's a kind of, it's a field of tension, and it's very in these new spaces. Difficult to get the balance right. So there is a breakdown. I mean, you know, but it may not be a universal breakdown. You know, I mean, as we know from populist politics, opinions can be widely divided, and they are at these sites. You know, they are quite controversial, some of them. Like there's this one in Bangalore, the Kemp Fort Shiva, which is like this huge seated Shiva behind a department store. So speaking of, you know, commerce, and that was definitely a land grab. I mean, everyone knows that. And that's very controversial. Many people come to it, love it as a pilgrimage site. Others just find it too commercial, too crowded, too intense, and completely sort of nakedly commercial. So, you know, I was saying that these elements are all intermingled, but not without controversy. You know, why? Because we also inhabit a frame. I mean, again, it's about the many different frames being at work. So there's a frame in which religion, politics, and commerce go together. There's also a frame, like the one that you just put forward, where they are supposed to be distinct. And so there are many different ways of approach, you know, depending on which frame you're wanting to inhabit. So that's the kind of complexity I think we need to be looking at, yeah. But I will think more about, you know, thinking of it in the terms of breakdown of the auratic circuit. That's great, yeah.
Yeah, Jack.
So I have this disease that I'm always thinking about Vrindavan these days because I'm trying to, you know, get to a book sooner than later. So here's an expression of that disease. By the way, however, other things came along. You know, I love the fact that you began with the sarvajanika as a new thing, parallel to Sanatana and so forth, really 19th century expressions, advantages to this. And then think about the word local. which would have a very different kind of history, and would be a very different way of speaking about publics, actually. It responds to, in a way, what Chaco is saying about the deep history and its relation to more recent forms. But let me focus on one Vrindavan place, and there are many huge Vrindavan places. That, I think, is another lesson of your talk today. Namely, that big is not always just big. There are different kinds of big, and that big signifies different things. The question of where the viewer is located or imagined is always at issue when you make something big, but it may not just be a visitor to the site itself, but far distant. When Vrindavan's tallest structure is projected to be built, it will be taller than the world's greatest mosque, which is in Africa. They know that. So there are many viewers. But the site I found myself thinking about particularly in your talk was the importation of Vaishnava Devi to Vrindavan. Vaishnava Devi, sits in her mountain place, but we have a problem with mountains in Vrindavan. It's flat as the Lord made it, and the one mountain anywhere nearby, Govardhan, is said to be sinking year by year because of our collective sins. So what do? You build a mountain, of course, and we have the materials to do it, and then up top goes Vaishnava Devi. So a very interesting to me feature of that site, aside from the fact that it's positioned as a Dwarapala for Vrindavan as a whole, so it is physically a mediator, I think, between Gurgaon/Delhi and that mediator and Vrindavan. Aside from that is what happens to you if you go there. There are several sites in Vrindavan where you have to pass, you have to pass through a security place to get in. Prem Mandir comes to mind. But in Vaishnava Devi, you have to give up your cell phone and you have to fill out a form, as in some government office, in order to make your way into the site. So the boundary of the site, it's not just the bigness, but the way in which the aura is being simultaneously policed and created through this very different kind of public vocabulary. It's more pronounced than any other site, and it's more hokey from a Vrindavan, Asli Vrindavan point of view than others. But there it is. And it's a major feature, I think, of what it means to come to that site. A beautiful example, I would think, in my own kind of knowledge, of the kind of circuitry that you're describing, where the word aura doesn't really capture what's being done to create that aura boundaries being specifically created. And one could go on, then school groups go through it, and they're all sort of, they've got their teachers are encouraging, Jain Mata Di, Jain Mata Di, they're doing the Punjabi, but at the same time there's this discourse about how should be respectful. That sense of how so many frames, as you put it, are interacting in a specific space just help to illuminate how I personally am trying to think about this science. So, this must be happening to other people in different parts of the world all around the room. I thank you for opening these things up.
Well, thank you for putting it that way. I mean, absolutely. I feel like what's happening with a lot of the new sites is that they're borrowing the idioms of governmentality, right? And, those kinds of discipline in order to read. So my example was that photography is prohibited as a punishable offense.
Yes.
Right now, what dandaniya? So who's giving that dand? It's the law, right? I mean, it's the state. So again, they're kind of in cahoots here, and borrowing from each other's vocabularies. I mean, I think we need to look at it both ways.
And by the way, no photography at Vaishnava Devi.
Right. So or Akshardham is another one. They take away your cell phone and your camera, and there you can't even go backwards. It's like your route is policed, and you can't. I tried because and they were like, no, you have to complete the circuit and then retrieve your child's milk or whatever it was I needed. Yeah.
Yes, the question.
So just to return to an earlier point and maybe just press a tiny bit harder on it, and then ask a sort of a sideways question. But in the first case, I guess, in your response to the question about framing it as in continuity with earlier processions or larger images, if I could press on that a little, you said it was different because in one case you have the sort of sarvajanika idea, and then the other things that were organized by temples or mattas. And I mean, this won't be news to you, but just to sort of, to say that there is some way in which a lot of those things would be backed by the local rajas, and you could frame them perhaps as having a very strong, also political dimension. The other thing I was curious if you ran into, because your framing, and I appreciate the framing, is one of saying these are religious in some ways events that are happening. I believe your framing was under the rubric of culture, heritage, etc. Did you find much evidence of people approaching it as a culture/heritage issue? I mean, I think of cases where I've run across, this is my area properly, but Muslim communities that sponsor a Durga Puja. Because there are cash prizes involved, and it's how you compete with the neighborhood next door. And if you talk to people, they say, well, no, we're not. It's not really. We're in it just because it's a cultural thing. So I mean, in some ways, maybe that is. I guess I wonder how much of that kind of thing have you seen, and how would you integrate it into your presentation?
Oh, lots. And I mean, in a way, that's my point. It's never either or. It's always and, right? So if Tilak wanted it to be exclusive, that's one thing. So that was my emphasis, was it was intended as a, the Ganapati Utsav, as a means of driving a wedge between the communities and demarcating them as separate, when there was actually much more exchange going on. So that exchange hasn't disappeared either, right? So yes, both frames are at work and they're competing. And so, for example, I mean, the big statue sites are tourist sites. And of course, Muslims go, Hindus go, with varying levels of, again, it's a mix of, I think I always visualize a sort of sound mixer, amping up the devotion and pulling down the entertainment, and it can change at different times of the day. Like there's this one big Shiva on the Karnataka coast against the Arabian Sea, very scenic spot. So throughout the day there are, school groups and armed forces groups and retirees and whatever filing past. And then suddenly at sunset, it just becomes a tourist site because the sunset is so spectacular. You know what I'm saying? So again, it's about seeing which mix is at work at what moment and for whom.
Yes, go on.
I was interested in the Sanctum Sanctorum. You briefly referred to it. And it made me think about how the temple itself is a kind of, it's a complex of different phases of very private religion, which you can identify with the Sanctum Sanctorum, but with the public religion, sort of being in different spaces of the temple. So, it made me wonder about how one might think about religion in its public spaces, even before it has entered into the street, and how the public religion of the temple is in many ways defined by the idea of the Sanctum Sanctorum. So I just wondered if you might want to say something about how the just kind of the spatial organization of the Hindu temple sort of provides a template for thinking about public religion.
Just a quick intervention.
Sure.
And that is Phyllis Granoff, when she wrote For God's Gardens and Lovers, talks precisely about this in 11th century temples. And that is the public dimension and the usage that goes all the way from lovers making out to
Concerts.
Concerts, of course, but even just the very casual plebeian way of what happens in temples that is very public. And I think that it's worth thinking about the fact that we as scholars, and our historians particularly, have often completely divorced the formation of temples in a particular way.
Right.
that actually was not like that. And Bandyopadhyaya has written a lot about the economic and political dimension of territoriality, of where temples were being built, which is entirely around economic and political dimension. So to some extent, I think we also have to think about the fact that we've put these earlier things in a particular way, and putting only the spiritual and the formal qualities at the center when it was not necessarily so. And there is plenty of documentation that suggests that. So you might want to think about the critique of the way we have looked at the earlier things too.
I mean, in a way, that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, with this category of iconic exhibition value, is to say that there was always a public side, whether in the West or, you know, in the Hindu temple. That is precisely it, and that that public side has always had some interaction with the sanctum, you know. So, I mean, and then we need to think more about who, like the question you asked, who is in control at what moment, right? I mean, there's a way in which the Utsava Murti, you know, there's a very controlled way in which certain gods are designated to go out, but then for how long? And I mean, that's the other thing that happens with Ganapati Puja, is that they're out there for longer, but then they have to be cooled. Now these big statues are just out there the whole time, like nobody's cooling them. You know what I mean? So there's that kind of difference too. But yes, what I would love that if we could now go back and say, what is it? You know, why are we focusing so much on the sanctum? And what happens as we go out of it? And that's why I feel like it's very important to think about, I mean, as you're saying, the streets beyond. Because the streets beyond, I mean, that's what happens at the Vaikom temple is, you know, with the great Vaikom Satyagraha.
But I guess it's also, if one could say that the idea of the sanctum sanctorum also establishes the lines of inclusion and exclusion, because this is really, quite literally, the heart of the temple. So even the normative ideas of inside and outside already are established, you know, within the temple before we even, you know, see the processions in the street.
Right. Yeah. I mean, but I think we need to kind of do more work to specify what's going on in terms of their spatiality and how that works, that kind of along a kind of temporal and spatial axis, right? At what time, for how long, you know, how intensely, and who gets to go where. Absolutely. Yeah.
I would love to see scholars, a lot of scholars talk about history instead of his or her story. I gave a lecture on that one too. Someone mentioned the word interior, but enter. The money expect. This is where the rosary, this is older than the rosary. Is it known, or does anyone talk about the body of Christ being put on the cross 700 AD? There was no body on the cross. When they dragged,
caste is one question, and gender is a whole other issue that we do need to look at.
Christ, the body was put, it stayed up there, but when the bishop said, take it down. When the collection went down, Christ went back upon the cross. That's a documented fact. But you never hear nothing about that. It's not talked about. But you're saying the sanctum, that's how that was taken outside. And it was about the money. It was more, it wasn't about the spirituality, that was about money.
And that's the thing. I think that there's a way in which a lot of what I've been talking about applies not just to India and Hinduism. I mean, I think it has ramifications beyond. But that's not my job to look at.
But your paper was very
not
good.
my area.
Kajri, thank you so much. That was a wonderful start to this series, and I appreciate your coming from Toronto, and appreciate you all for coming today to start us off well. So thank you so much.
Very good.